The rain stung James's face as he stood outside the old diner, its neon sign flickering like a dying pulse. He hadn't been back to Willow Creek in 10 years. Not since the night he and Ethan swore to bury their truth. Now, the letter in his pocket burned hotter than the shame they'd once carried. It was 2015, and Willow Creek, a sleepy town in upstate New York, hadn't changed much. The same brick buildings lined Main Street. The same church bells tolled on Sundays. And the same whispers followed anyone who dared to be different. James, at 22, had been the golden boy varsity football star. Prom king. The one everyone expected to marry a sweet girl and settle into a predictable life. But Ethan, the quiet artist with sharp cheekbones and a sketchbook always in hand, had been his unraveling. They'd met in senior year, in the art room after hours, when James, bored and restless, wandered in and found Ethan painting a mural of a stormy sea. "You're wasting your time with that," James had teased, leaning against the doorframe. Ethan didn't look up, just smirked and said, "And you're wasting yours pretending you're someone you're not." That was the start. Electric, unspoken, dangerous. Their love grew in stolen moments, late-night drives to the edge of town, hands brushing in the dark of Ethan's beat-up Chevy, kisses hidden behind the abandoned mill. But Willow Creek wasn't kind to boys like them. When Ethan's father, Pastor Daniel, caught them one night, his rage was biblical. "You're an abomination," he'd spat, his voice trembling with disgust. Ethan, only 20, stood tall, but James saw the fear in his eyes. They made a pact that night: keep it secret, keep it safe, until they could escape. James pulled his jacket tighter against the rain, staring at the diner's door. The letter, slipped under his Brooklyn apartment door last week, had no return address. Just Ethan's handwriting: "Come back. I need you. It's time." 10 years of silence. And now this. He pushed the door open, the bell jingling like a memory. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and grease. The same as always. Ethan sat in their old booth, his flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows, his dark hair longer now, curling at the nape of his neck. He looked up, and their eyes locked, blue meeting green, a decade of unspoken words crashing between them. "James," Ethan said, his voice low, steady, but laced with something fragile. "You came." James slid into the booth, his heart pounding. "You didn't give me much choice." He pulled the letter from his pocket, setting it on the table like evidence. "What's this about?" Ethan's fingers traced the edge of his coffee mug, his gaze dropping. "I'm tired, James. Tired of hiding. Tired of pretending I'm someone I'm not." James's chest tightened. He'd built a life in Brooklyn, safe, solitary, a graphic designer with a small circle of friends who didn't ask about his past. But Ethan had stayed, bound by family, by the church, by a town that demanded conformity. "What changed?" James asked, leaning forward. Ethan's eyes flicked up, fierce now. "My father's dying, and I'm done keeping his secretor hours." The words hit like a punch. James remembered Pastor Daniel's threats, the way he'd forced Ethan to stay silent, to fix himself through conversion therapy. James had fled to New York, promising to wait for Ethan, but Ethan never followed. The silence had grown, heavy with guilt and unspoken love. "You're saying you want to. What?" "Tell everyone." James's voice was barely a whisper. Ethan leaned closer, his hand brushing James's on the table. "I'm saying I want to live. James. Really live. With you. If you'll have me." The diner faded, the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, until it was just them, the weight of 10 years, and the promise they'd made. James wanted to say yes, to pull Ethan into his arms and never let go. But fear, that old companion, crept in. Willow Creek wasn't just a place. It was a cage. And coming out here, now, could break them both. I need time, James said finally, his voice cracking. Ethan nodded, but his eyes held a quiet plea. As James stood to leave, Ethan grabbed his wrist, his touch warm, grounding. Don't make me wait another 10 years, Ethan said, half smiling, half breaking. James walked back into the rain, the letter still in his pocket, Ethan's words echoing in his head. He didn't know if he was ready to face the town, the past, or the truth. But one thing was clear. The love they'd buried was clawing its way back to the surface. And it wouldn't stay hidden much longer. James drove through Willow Creek's empty streets, the rain smearing the windshield like tears. The town felt smaller now, suffocating. Every corner a reminder of the summer he and Ethan thought they could outrun the world. He pulled into the motel lot, the neon vacancy sign buzzing like a warning. Inside his room, he sat on the edge of the bed, the letter open in his hands. Ethan's words were simple, but they carried a weight that made James's chest ache. I need you. It's time. He thought of the last time they'd spoken, 10 years ago, when Ethan had called him from a payphone, his voice shaking. I can't leave yet, Ethan had said. My dad, he's sick. I have to stay. James had begged him to come to New York. But Ethan's duty to family had won. James had hung up, angry, hurt, and alone. Now, Ethan was ready to break free. But James wasn't sure he could. He'd spent a decade building walls safe. Predictable walls. Coming out in Willow Creek meant facing not just the town's judgment, but his own family's. His parents, devout and traditional, had never suspected. Or if they did, they'd buried it deeper than James had buried his own heart. The next morning, James drove to the church where Pastor Daniel still preached. It was a squat, white building with a steeple that loomed over the town like a judge. Ethan had asked him to meet there. Of all places, James parked across the street, watching families file in for Sunday service. Their faces familiar, older, but unchanged in their certainty. Ethan was waiting by the oak tree out front, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. He looked different in the daylight, tired, but defiant, like he'd been carrying a weight too long and was finally ready to set it down. You're early, Ethan said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. So are you, James replied, shoving his hands in his pockets. Why here? Ethan glanced at the church, his expression darkening. Because this is where it all started, where he tried to break me. James followed Ethan's gaze, memories flooding back. The summer after they were caught, Pastor Daniel had sent Ethan to a camp outside Albany. Ethan never talked about it, but when he came back, his sketches had turned darker storms, jagged cliffs, faces without eyes. James had wanted to ask, but the shame of leaving Ethan behind had silenced him. My father's last sermon is today, Ethan said, his voice steady but tight. He's stepping down. Cancer's got him. I want him to see us together before he goes. Not to hurt him, but to show him I'm not ashamed anymore. James's stomach twisted. Ethan, that's a lot. What if it makes things worse? Ethan turned to him, his eyes blazing. Worse than living a lie. Worse than losing you. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. I spent 10 years trying to be the son he wanted. I went to that camp. I prayed. I tried to change. But I couldn't stop loving you. James. I won't. James's throat tightened. He wanted to reach out, to hold Ethan. But the church doors were still open, and eyes were everywhere. What about your mom? Your sister? The town? They'll survive, Ethan said, his jaw set. But I won't if I keep hiding. Before James could respond, a voice called out, Ethan. It was Sarah, Ethan's younger sister, now 25, her blonde hair tied back, her face a mix of surprise and suspicion. She crossed the street, glancing at James. What's he doing here? Ethan didn't flinch. He's with me. Sarah's eyes narrowed, but she didn't press. Dad's asking for you. He's weak, but he's stubborn as ever. Ethan nodded, then turned to James. Come with me, please. James hesitated, the weight of the town's gaze pressing down. But Ethan's hand brushed his. A silent plea, and James nodded. They walked into the church together, the air thick with incense and judgment. Pastor Daniel stood at the pulpit, frielier than James remembered, his voice still commanding as he spoke of redemption. When his eyes landed on Ethan and James, side by side, his words faltered. The congregation turned, whispers rippling through the pews. James felt exposed, raw, but Ethan stood tall, his hand steady at his side. This was the moment they'd feared, the moment they'd fought for. James didn't know if they'd walk out whole, but for the first time in years, he felt alive. The church was suffocating, its wooden pews creaking under the weight of 100 staring eyes. James felt every glance, every whisper, like needles on his skin. Ethan stood beside him, unyielding, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of scrutiny. Pastor Daniel's sermon had stopped mid-sentence, his frail hands gripping the pulpit. His eyes, once sharp with righteous fire, were clouded now, but they locked onto Ethan with a mix of shock and something soft regret. Maybe. Ethan, he said, his voice hoarse, barely carrying over the murmurs. You're here. Ethan stepped forward, his chin raised. I am. And I'm not alone. James's heart pounded as he followed Ethan down the aisle. The congregation's whispers grew louder, a low hum of judgment and curiosity. He recognized faces Mrs. Callahan, who'd baked him cookies as a kid. Mr. Reynolds, his old football coach. Their eyes held questions, accusations, and a few glimmers of sympathy. Pastor Daniel gestured weakly to the front pew. Sit, he said, his voice trembling. Both of you. They sat, the wood cold beneath James's hands. Ethan's knee brushed his. A small reassurance. The sermon resumed. But it was halting, disjointed. Daniel spoke of forgiveness, of love, but his eyes kept drifting to his son. When the service ended, the congregation lingered, their stares heavy as they filed out. Daniel approached, leaning on a cane, his face etched with pain. Ethan, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why now? Ethan stood, his voice steady. Because I'm done hiding. Dad, I'm done pretending I'm not who I am. Daniel's eyes flicked to James, then back to Ethan. This is your choice. It's not a choice, Ethan said, his voice cracking for the first time. It's who I am. Who we are. James felt the weight of those words, the years of pain behind them. He wanted to speak, to defend Ethan, but his throat was tight. Instead, he reached for Ethan's hand, their fingers intertwining. Daniel's gaze dropped to their joined hands. And for a moment, James thought he saw tears. I tried to save you, Daniel said, his voice breaking. I thought I was doing right by you. You thought wrong, Ethan said, but there was no anger in his voice. Only exhaustion. I don't need saving. I need you to see me. Daniel swayed, and Sarah, who'd been hovering nearby, rushed to his side. Dad, let's go home, she said, her voice soft but firm. She glanced at Ethan, her expression unreadable. Then at James. "You're staying." James nodded, his grip on Ethan's hand tightening. "Yeah." Sarah helped Daniel out, the church emptying until it was just James and Ethan. The silence was heavy, broken only by the creak of the pews. Ethan sank back down, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't think it'd feel like this," he admitted, his voice raw, free, but heavy. James turned to him, his thumb brushing over Ethan's knuckles. "You were incredible," he said. "I don't know how you did that." Ethan laughed, a small, broken sound. "I've had 10 years to practice." They sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling around them. James thought of the boy Ethan had been scared, defiant, sketching storms to keep himself sane. He thought of the man he was now, brave in a way James wasn't sure he could match. "What now?" James asked, his voice quiet. Ethan looked at him, his eyes soft but determined. "We live together. No more secrets." James wanted to believe it was that simple, but Willow Creek wasn't done with them. As they left the church, hand in hand, a group of men stood by the oak tree, their faces hard. James recognized one Tommy, his old teammate, now broader, angrier. "You think you can just walk in here like that?" Tommy said, his voice low, threatening. Ethan stepped forward, shielding James slightly. "We're not hiding anymore. Tommy, deal with it." Tommy's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. The others muttered, their eyes dark, but no one stepped closer. James felt Ethan's hand tremble, but his stance was firm. They walked past, the tension thick, and James knew this was only the beginning. The air outside the church was sharp with the scent of rain-soaked leaves. James and Ethan walked to Ethan's truck, their steps deliberate, as if daring the town to stop them. The men by the oak tree watched, their silence louder than any words. But no one followed. In the truck, Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "I thought I was ready for that," he said, his voice low. But seeing him dad like that, James reached over, resting a hand on Ethan's arm. "You stood up to him. To all of them. That's more than I could have done." Ethan shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not brave, James. I'm just tired." They drove to Ethan's small house on the edge of town, a place James had never seen. It was modest, with peeling paint and a front porch cluttered with art supplies. Inside, Ethan's sketches covered the wall's landscapes. Faces, moments captured in charcoal and ink. James paused at a drawing of their old bridge, the one where they'd first kissed. "You kept this," he said, his voice thick. Ethan stood behind him, close enough that James felt his warmth. "I kept everything." They sat on the couch, the space between them small but heavy. Ethan told James about the years apart, the conversion therapy, the nights he'd spent sketching to keep himself sane, the slow realization that he couldn't change who he was. "I stayed for my dad," Ethan said. "I thought I owed him that. But I lost you." James's chest ached. "You didn't lose me. I ran." Ethan's eyes met his, searching. "Why didn't you come back?" "I was scared," James admitted, the words spilling out. "Scared of this town, of what it'd do to us. I thought you'd be better off without me dragging you down." Ethan leaned closer, his hand finding James's. "You were never the one dragging me down." The air shifted, charged with the weight of years unspoken. James leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both familiar and new, soft, then desperate, a decade's worth of longing pouring out. When they pulled apart, Ethan's eyes were wet, I missed you, he whispered. I missed you too, James said, his voice breaking. Every day? They talked late into the night, piecing together the years they'd lost. Ethan had stayed in Willow Creek, teaching art at the community center, living quietly but never fully himself. James had thrown himself into work, into a life that felt safe but empty. Neither had found anyone else, not really. The next morning, they went to the diner, hand in hand, a quiet act of defiance. The stares were immediate, the whispers sharp. Mrs. Callahan, behind the counter, served them coffee without a word. But her eyes lingered. Curious, not cruel. Others weren't so kind. A man at the counter muttered something about sin, loud enough for them to hear. Ethan didn't flinch. Let them talk, he said, his voice calm but firm. They'll get used to it. James wasn't so sure. He saw the tension in Ethan's jaw, the way his hand tightened around his mug. This wasn't just about them. It was about the town, the church, the weight of a past that wouldn't let go. When Tommy and his friends walked in, the air grew heavier. Ethan, Tommy said, leaning against their booth, his voice dripping with disdain. You really think this is going to fly here? Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. I don't need your permission. Tommy. Tommy's eyes flicked to James, a smirk twisting his lips. And you, golden boy, thought you were smarter than this. James felt the old fear rise, but Ethan's hand on his steadied him. We're not asking for your approval, James said, his voice stronger than he felt. We're just living. Tommy laughed, cold and sharp, but he backed off, his friends following. The diner stayed tense, but no one else approached. James looked at Ethan, his heart swelling with something like pride. You're braver than you think, he said. Ethan smiled, small but real. Maybe I'm just borrowing your courage. They left the diner, the town's eyes on their backs. James knew this was only the start. Willow Creek wouldn't change overnight. But with Ethan beside him, he felt something he hadn't in years: hope. The days that followed were a tightrope walk. James stayed at Ethan's house, the two of them navigating a town that seemed to watch their every move. They were careful but unapologetic, holding hands in public, sharing quiet moments at the bridge, reclaiming the spaces where their love had once been hidden. Ethan took James to the community center, where he taught art to kids and adults alike. The room was a riot of color, walls covered with student paintings, Ethan's sketches tucked in corners. A teenage girl, Mia, with purple streaks in her hair, ran up to Ethan, holding a canvas. Mr. E, check this out, she said, her enthusiasm cutting through the room's quiet. Ethan smiled, genuine and warm. That's incredible. Mia, keep pushing those colors. He glanced at James, a flicker of pride in his eyes. This is James, my partner. Mia's eyes widened, but she grinned. Cool. You an artist too? James laughed, caught off guard. Not like him. I just draw logos for a living. She shrugged, unbothered, and ran back to her easel. James watched Ethan move through the room, encouraging, patient, a side of him James hadn't seen in their youth. You're good at this, James said later, as they cleaned up. You're giving them something this town never gave us. Ethan paused, a paintbrush in hand. I stayed because I wanted to make it better. For them. For me. That night, they sat on Ethan's porch, the air cool and sharp. James told Ethan about Brooklyn, his small apartment, the freelance work, the nights he'd spent staring at old photos of them. Ethan listened, his hand resting on James's knee, grounding him. I should have come for you, James said, his voice thick. I'm sorry. Ethan shook his head. We both did what we thought we had to. But we're here now. The moment was broken by headlights pulling into the driveway. Sarah stepped out, her face tight. Ethan, it's Dad. He's in the hospital. It's bad. Ethan's hand tightened on James's, but he nodded. We'll come. At the hospital, Pastor Daniel lay in a sterile room, tubes snaking from his arms. He looked smaller, fragile, nothing like the man who'd once terrified them. Sarah stood by the window, her arms crossed, her eyes red. He's been asking for you, she said to Ethan, her voice soft but strained. Ethan sat by the bed, James standing behind him. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, focusing on his son. Ethan, he whispered. I was wrong. Ethan froze, his breath catching. What? I thought I was saving you, Daniel said, his voice barely audible. But I see it now. You're my son. And I failed you. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, but he didn't look away. I just wanted you to love me, he said, his voice breaking. All of me. Daniel reached out, his hand trembling, and Ethan took it. James watched, his heart aching, as father and son held on to each other. Years of pain and love tangled together. Sarah turned away, wiping her eyes. When Daniel drifted back to sleep, Ethan stood, his face raw but resolute. I didn't expect that, he admitted, leaning into James. I thought he'd die hating me. James pulled him close, his arm steady. He sees you now. That's what matters. They left the hospital, the night air cool against their skin. Sarah caught up with them in the parking lot, her expression softer. I didn't get it before, she said, her voice hesitant. But I'm trying. I want you to be happy, Ethan. Ethan hugged her. A quick, fierce embrace. Thank you, he whispered. As they drove back, James felt the weight of the day settle. Ethan's father's words were a crack in the wall, a small victory in a town that still resisted. But it was something to start. And with Ethan beside him, James began to believe they could face whatever came next. Willow Creek didn't soften overnight. The whispers followed James and Ethan grocery store aisles, the post office, the diner. But Ethan moved through it with a quiet strength, his hand finding James's in defiance of the stairs. James, still adjusting to the town's weight, felt his old fears resurface. But Ethan's presence steadied him. They spent their days rebuilding what they'd lost. Mornings at the community center, evenings on the porch, nights tangled together, relearning each other's rhythms. Ethan's sketches began to change less stormy, more vibrant, with colors James hadn't seen in his work before. One night, Ethan showed him a drawing of them on the bridge, their hands intertwined, the river glowing under moonlight. This is us now, Ethan said, his voice soft, not hiding anymore. James traced the lines of the sketch, his throat tight. It's beautiful. But the town's resistance lingered. One evening, as they walked back from the diner, a brick sailed through Ethan's living room window, shattering glass across the floor. A note was tied to it, scrawled in angry letters, "Leave." Ethan's face paled, but his jaw set. They don't get to win, he said, crumpling the note. James called the police, but the officer, an old classmate named Mike, was dismissive. Probably just kids, he said, barely glancing at the note. You know how it is. No, Ethan snapped, his voice sharp. I know how you let it be. Mike shifted uncomfortably but didn't argue. After he left, James helped Ethan board up the window, their silence heavy. Maybe we should leave, James said, his voice low. Start over somewhere else. Ethan shook his head. I'm not running. Not again. The next day, Ethan organized a meeting at the community center. He invited his students, their parents, anyone willing to listen. James stood by the door, nervous but proud, as Ethan spoke to the small crowd. I've lived here my whole life, Ethan said, his voice clear. I've hidden who I am to make you comfortable. But I'm done. I love James, and I'm not ashamed of it. If you can't accept that, that's your loss. Mia, the girl with purple hair, stood up, clapping loudly. A few others joined, hesitant but genuine. Some parents looked uncomfortable, but no one walked out. It wasn't acceptance. Not yet, but it was a start. Afterward, Mia hugged Ethan, her eyes bright. You're awesome, Mr. E, she said. Don't let the jerks get you down. Ethan laughed, ruffling her hair. Thanks, kid. That night, James and Ethan sat on the porch, the boarded-up window a reminder of the fight ahead. You were incredible today, James said, his hand finding Ethan's. I don't know how you do it. Ethan leaned into him, his voice soft. I do it because you're here. Because we're worth it. James kissed him, slow and steady, the world fading around them. For the first time, he felt like they could build something real, not just a secret, but a life. But as they sat there, headlights flashed in the distance, slowing as they passed the house. James's stomach twisted. The town wasn't done with them yet. The threats didn't stop. Notes slipped under Ethan's door. Tires slashed on his truck. Whispered slurs in the grocery store. James wanted to fight, to confront every coward who hid behind anonymity. But Ethan urged restraint. We fight by living, he said, by not letting them scare us. But fear was a constant shadow. James started checking the locks twice, waking at every creak in the house. Ethan, though, seemed to grow stronger, his defiance a quiet fire. He kept teaching, kept sketching, kept holding James's hand in public, even when it drew stares. One afternoon, Sarah called. Dad wants to see you both, she said, her voice hesitant. He's not doing well. At the hospital, Daniel was fading, his breathing shallow. Ethan sat by his side, James standing close. I'm sorry, Daniel whispered, his eyes on Ethan. I should have loved you better. Ethan's hand trembled as he took his father's. I know you tried, he said, his voice thick. I forgive you. Daniel's eyes closed, a tear slipping down his cheek. He died that night, quietly, with Ethan and Sarah by his side. James stood back, giving them space, his heart heavy with the weight of it all. The funeral was a test. The church was packed, the town's eyes on Ethan and James as they sat together, hands clasped. Some faces softened Mrs. Callahan brought them a casserole later, her smile tentative but kind. Others, like Tommy, stayed cold, their presence a reminder of the battle still raging. After the funeral, Ethan and James returned to the bridge, their old sanctuary. The river flowed steadily, the air crisp with autumn. Ethan pulled out his sketchbook, flipping to a new page. I want to draw us here, he said. Not the past, the future. James watched him sketch, the lines sure and bold. What's the future look like? He asked, his voice soft. Ethan looked up, his eyes bright. You and me. Here. Or somewhere else. Together. Free. James smiled, his heart full. I like that future. They stayed until dusk, the sky burning orange and pink. For the first time, James felt the town's weight lift. Just a little. They weren't alone anymore. Mia and her friends, Sarah, even Mrs. Callahan, were small signs of change. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Months passed, and Willow Creek began to shift. Slowly, unevenly. Ethan's classes at the community center grew. Kids like Mia bringing friends who didn't care about the town's old rules. Sarah started coming by the house. Her visits awkward but genuine. A bridge between the past and something new. The threats didn't vanish, but they lessened. The town's anger dulled by time and Ethan's quiet resilience. James decided to stay. He set up a small design studio in Ethan's house, working remotely while helping with the community center. They built a life small, imperfect, but theirs. The bridge became their ritual, a place to talk, to dream, to sketch. Ethan's drawings filled the house, a gallery of their love, their fight, their future. One spring evening, Ethan organized an art show at the community center, showcasing his students' work alongside his own. The town came, some out of curiosity, some out of respect. Ethan's centerpiece was a mural of the bridge, with two figures standing together, their hands joined, the river flowing beneath them. The plaque read, "For James, who kept my heart free." James stood beside him, his eyes wet, as the crowd murmured, some nodding, some smiling. Mia ran up, hugging them both. "You guys are like goals," she said, laughing. Later, on the bridge, Ethan turned to James, his face soft in the moonlight. "I promise to keep your secret," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm glad we're not a secret anymore." James pulled him close, their lips meeting, the river a quiet witness. "The love we shared deserves to live freely," he whispered. "Forever." And as they stood there, the town's lights flickering in the distance, James knew they'd done more than survive. They'd carved out a space for love, for truth, in a place that had tried to bury it. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It was everything.